This is day one of talking about something complicated on my feet in order to become a better public speaker or on my feet speaker. Today, I want to talk about the different types of monopolies. There are three different types of monopolies that we mainly see. But before getting into what those three different types of monopolies are, let's talk about what a monopoly is by giving the definition. A monopoly is when a company has or any organization has complete control over a certain market. In other words, they block their competition from entering that market. The reason a monopoly is a problem is because by blocking competition, these companies allow themselves to set the prices at whatever they want. They also, by blocking their competition, are able to limit the innovation in a market to whatever they deem necessary in order to keep their consumers from simply rioting. So, a monopoly stalls innovation and keeps prices higher than they otherwise would be. Because companies, when they have no competition, have no incentive to increase their efficiency any more than is necessary to keep their consumers buying at all. So now that we've defined exactly what a monopoly is, let's talk about the three different types that we see common. The first is a government monopoly. A government monopoly is when a government enforces a monopoly. And this is actually a very simple type of monopoly because the government, having actual force at its fingertips, that being the military, or also regulatory abilities, enforced by the military, is able, or police forces, is able to effectively block other companies from entering a certain market. Sometimes government-enforced monopolies can be by the government to enforce a single corporation's domination over a market, or government-run monopolies can be the government blocking any other corporations from competing with the government-run entity in a certain market. An example of that second statement might be if the government were to block any space companies from competing with NASA. If the government said that no private corporations could compete with the government-run NASA. And this is actually done with air traffic control, as an example. Air traffic control is run by the government as an organization, and the government does not allow any other corporations or companies to participate in this market. It's locked off from civilian participation. And so that's a government-controlled monopoly. Obviously, government can also grant exclusive rights to operate in a certain market to just a single company. For example, Friedrich Tudor, who was a ice merchant in nearly 2 centuries ago, received government contracts from the governments of Cuba and Jamaica, with the contract to exclusively sell ice to those islands. Those contracts allowed him to raise his prices however high he wanted, without fear of competition from other ice merchants. So now that we've seen examples of government-run monopolies, let's talk about the second type of monopoly. This type of monopoly it could be known as simply a corporate monopoly. There are more two types of corporate monopolies. The first type of corporate monopoly is effectively when a corporation uses force in order to establish monopoly, force or intimidation, threats. They use sneaky tactics in order to block their competition from entering a market, or to end their competition's attempt to be in that market. I can't think of any examples at the moment, but a corporation can use their power in order to block competition from also entering the market. A note here. When a corporation is simply more efficient than other corporations, or better at producing products, therefore making it one of the biggest corporations in that market, that is not a monopoly. To be a monopoly, a corporation must actually block competition, not just be better than, not just outcompete it. So, for example, Walmart, which is obviously an enormous company with an enormous share of the retail market, is still not a monopoly because Walmart does not control the retail market. They may be much larger than most of their opponents or competitors in that market, but they don't control it. They don't block others from participating in it. Even if a single company has 100%, it's 100% of the sales in a particular market, that does not make it a monopoly. It only becomes a monopoly once it stops competitors from entering that market. Similarly, a company is also not a monopoly simply because it's big. A company is only a monopoly when it blocks others from entering. So, for a corporation to be a monopoly, it must actually stop other corporations from entering that. It can do that through first threats of force, intimidation, violence, or wielding the government in order to try to in order to get the government to block other corporations from entering the market. Second, a corporation can lower its own prices below what it would normally sell in order to undercut their opponent in the short term. After undercutting their opponents in the short term, they can again raise prices. Their opponents would have vanished because they couldn't survive. Because they lacked the liquid funds in order to survive for as long. One example of this was in Indonesia, or an attempt at this was in Indonesia, where a large corporation selling chicken meat attempted to destroy the local farmers who sold chickens. Their attempts failed because the local Indonesian farmers who sold chickens band together in order to compete with the larger chicken selling corporation. However, in many cases, it's plausible that the large Indonesian chicken corporation could have prevailed. By selling its chickens for such low prices, it could have driven the local Indonesian farmers out of business and blocked that market off from them because it simply would not have been a rational decision for those farmers to continue in that market. The corporation would have created a monopoly. Finally, the third type of a monopoly is known as a technical monopoly. And a technical monopoly, this is actually an extremely interesting type of monopoly, where corporations don't necessarily block others from entering. They simply are more efficient, and it's impossible for any other corporation to become more efficient. Now, this sounds weird at first. How is it impossible for someone else to not be more efficient? We have to look at certain industries to understand this. Technical monopolies are not possible everywhere. They're only possible in a few specific cases. One example is the case of water mains. Water mains, once one company supplies water to enough houses in a neighborhood, it establishes a critical mass. Once it's done that, it's simply much easier for that one company to continue to supply water to more houses because it has the pipes nearest to any other house. A competitor would have to spend an inordinate amount of money in order to get pipes to that neighborhood in the first place, not to mention to actually convince customers to switch water suppliers. So, a monopoly in this case was only logical. Whichever company would logically form. Whichever company has the most water supply, controls the most water supply in that town, would almost necessarily have the cheaper prices, regardless of the product they create. A monopoly naturally forms over time in an industry like this. So, now that we've looked at three different types of monopolies, fairly nonsensically, unfortunately, we've seen that monopolies are dangerous because they stall innovation and because companies don't have to worry about their competitors. We've also seen how monopolies lower the incentive to create lower prices. When companies don't have to deal with competition because they block it, use government to stop it, or engage in an industry of a technical monopoly where monopolies naturally form, this harms consumers. In government-formed monopolies, the government often does not have bad intentions. It simply wants to do good. Unfortunately, those good intentions do not always do not always create good results. And then for corporate monopolies, even in corporate monopolies, the corporations do not always have bad intentions. They often simply want to deliver a good product. They simply want to deliver a good product without fear of competition. That fear of competition it does not mean that they are evil or greedy. It simply means that they are logical. The answer to this is not to hate on those who want to deliver products at low cost and earn large profit. Instead, the solution is to look to government to look to government to not take action, effectively to stop government from allowing these companies to have monopolies. The government should not grant exclusive rights to certain markets or allow companies to have control of certain markets. And finally, in the case of technical monopolies, the solution is much muddier. Obviously, here companies do not have bad intentions when they take over certain areas. But again, here the companies are not even trying to earn more profit. The companies are simply doing the logical thing. However, simply responding to the price system results in a situation where individual companies dominate large swaths of territory, and competitors are simply unable to enter, regardless of the intentions of their competitors. So, in technical monopolies, the problem is that monopolies naturally form. Here, the answer is complicated, but one answer is that government can create, it can effectively launch bidding wars for the servicing of certain neighborhoods. Different water companies can compete for how low of a price they are willing to provide water to a certain neighborhood. If a company fails to provide adequate water supply, the government can fine them. If a company provides water supply and is able to make a profit, they are able to continue to buy that lease. And this way competitors can still enter. If another competitor can service that water system for a lower price, they can simply, at a certain designated time, outbid their competitor and take over management of the neighborhood. Now this doesn't apply to all types of technical monopolies, but is one example of how technical monopolies can be dealt with. As economist Friedrich Hayek says in his book The Fatal Conceit, he talks about how to deal with monopolies and how governments should plan around them. He says that the problem that socialists have is that they believe that free markets are a danger, and they try to plan against free markets. Friedrich Hayek says that plans are necessary, of course, but the point of plans should never, as he says, be to plan against free markets. Instead, the plans should be for free markets. Free markets require planning, but free markets depend on planning to make sure they work, but the point of this planning is to make the free markets work, not to hurt the free markets. With these principles in mind, monopolies can be mitigated without destroying the prosperity that is necessary for countries to survive.